this life ain't fair. And I know that you're going nowhere. Well, don't blame me for what you've done, because I know that you are having fun.
Welcome to the Clarified Realty Podcast, exposing the real estate secrets your agent doesn't want you to know. Here's your host, Tom Clary.
Well, don't you just walk away. That's when I'll say.
Welcome to Clarified Realty Podcast, episode number 003. I'm Tom Clary. I just so happen to be a licensed real estate agent extraordinaire. Not sure if that's a real thing, but the real estate agent part of it sure is. My business is based in the lovely San Fernando Valley, and my office is in the gorgeous town of Calabasas, California. Yes, Justin Bieber lived there for a little bit, but please don't hold that against us. Thanks for coming back again. We're continuing with part 2 of our deep dive into mortgages and lending. My guest, once again, is also my sidekick / co-host, Ron Bruno. How you doing, Ron?
Doing great, Tom.
Awesome. Great. So we always start off our podcast with a little bit of interesting real estate news. Ron, you got anything out there?
I do. News came out yesterday. The European Central Bank, they've come to a consensus to reduce asset purchases to help spur the economies over there. Remember, in a couple podcasts ago, we talked about quantitative easing. We talked about how governments and central banks, they will manipulate the purchases of those securities. Well, you may want to know, how does that affect the U.S. mortgage market, right?
Right.
Well, the reason it affects it is because if the European Central Bank decides we're going to scale back the amount of securities we're going to buy, they also buy mortgage-backed securities from the U.S.
Right.
So if demand goes down, then prices go down, and bonds have an inverse relationship between the price and the actual yield. So if prices go down, that means the yield goes up.
Correct.
That means interest rates go up.
Right. So there's a tentative feeling that there might be some interest rate hikes in our future, is what I'm kind of hearing.
This is true.
Right. I also wanted to let everyone know that we're starting to see a bit more inventory out there in the market, at least here in the San Fernando Valley. In just one section of the area, even though there's about a 16% increase in prices year over year, we're actually seeing about a 14% rise in number of houses getting listed. So there's a real disconnect happening. Sellers are still basically thinking that their properties are worth more, but there are definitely more choices out on the market. So that means that if you're not priced accurately, we're seeing a lot more properties just kind of sit there. And it will be a real interesting to see what happens if indeed the rates do rise. And I've heard some rumblings that November is looking like we might see some sort of rise in the interest rates.
November or December. It's really when the Fed reconvenes and decides, are we going to move rates? But interest rates, they can rise regardless of the Fed, right? So if central banks around the world are starting to reduce and taper, right? So in 2013, there was a phenomenon called taper tantrum that some may remember. If they do continue that, then that can also drive interest rates.
Got it. All right. Well, awesome. Well, thanks for letting us know about that. We've got a lot of road to cover today. This is going to be one of our longer podcasts, I think. So I want to get right down to it. Our main goal for the conversation today will be, okay, so you've been pre-approved, you got your offer accepted. Now what? Basically, what happens when the deal is in escrow? We'll be covering topics like how you meet conditions, underwriting, the purpose of the appraisal, my favorite, the clear to close. I think that's just about everybody's getting a woo-hoo.
That's right.
Woo-hoo from Ron. So lots of topics, but I wanted to take a very quick step back, if I may, back to the whole choosing a lender conversation we were having before, and something I want you guys to understand, and something that you should be on the lookout for, and that's loan fees. What are the different types of costs associated with getting a loan? What are origination fees, junk fees, points, these things like that, because. And this is something we're starting to discuss during our last podcast. While the knowledge and general rapport you have with your loan officer is incredibly important, but in order to truly compare apples to apples, you do still need to look at what you're going to be charged at the end of the day. What are you going to pay? And I want to make sure that you do understand that I think that is also an important factor. It's not an important factor in choosing which lender you go with. So Ron, why don't you quickly explain the difference between an interest rate and an A.P.R, and then talk about how fees and points relate to the overall cost of getting a loan?
Sure. So what I'd like to do is kind of break it down, right? So the first item you mentioned was a rate.
Right.
So a rate, as I mentioned in my first interview, it's dependent on multiple factors, right? So the number one, the most common factors and the most important factors, number one is FICO.
Right.
Right. So again, we take the middle score of all three of the credit bureaus, and that becomes your FICO score. The next is how are you going to occupy the property? Right. So are you going to occupy it as a single family residence? Are you going to occupy it or a primary residence? Are you going to occupy it? Is it an investment property? Is it a second home? Next, number of units. So is it a single family residence? Is it a duplex? Is it a fourplex? Type of property, single family residence, a condo, a townhome. The down payment. So it matters how much you're actually putting down. Mm-hmm. So somebody, I mentioned this before, if someone's putting 10% down, they may not get as good of a rate as someone who's putting 40% down. Right? Because there's less risk associated with that.
Right.
The loan amount and then the purchase price. Right? So it's funny. People ask me, what's your rate?
Yeah.
And I say, it depends on the FICO, depends on the occupancy, depends on the down payment. And then they say, oh, wow, it sounds like you actually know what you're talking about.
Right.
So I always say our rates are competitive and it depends.
Right. I mean, and let me interrupt here. And when you're out there shopping for your mortgage as well, that's going to show how much you know about the process. If you go into someone and you say, what's the rate? Well, they kind of already know that it's not one size fits all. And you should know that. You should know that it actually is all these different other factors that play into what your specific rate is going to be.
Exactly. If you want to stump somebody, and this answers your second question, if you want to stump a loan officer, ask them what does A.P.R stand for and how it's calculated.
Yeah. Right.
Do you know what it is?
From what my understanding is the annual percentage rate.
Correct.
And it has to do it's the interest rate after all the fees have been added on.
That's right. That's exactly right. I am bowing down to you. I would say 95% of realtors do not know that.
Wow,
so the fact that you do know that's incredibly impressive. And I would say another 75% of loan officers, they may be able to say what A.P.R is, but they don't understand how it's calculated.
Right.
We basically take the interest rate and then we add in all of those factors of the closing costs, and that is your true interest rate.
Well, and that's why it's so, when we're really talking about how to compare apples to apples, it's really more effective to find out what your A.P.R is. I mean, it's not going to tell you the whole story, but it's definitely going to give you a much better idea of what the interest rate is with those fees added.
That's correct. So a big red flag would be, So a normal loan would have a rate at say 4.5%, and then an A.P.R at 4.625 or 4.8, depending on the loan amount, right? And it depends on what you have. If you have a 4.5% interest rate and then a 7% A.P.R, that means there are a lot of closing costs built into that.
They're charging
and
all sorts of stuff.
And if you don't know about that, then that is a red flag.
Right. Okay, great. So I think that gives us a pretty good idea of how you guys, another tool that you guys can use in order to compare your apples to apples and really make an educated decision about which loan to choose. And now another thing I wanted to talk about before we moved on to this second stage of the life of you buying a house, which is escrow, and how that has to do with loans. There's a lot of potential buyers that are out there on the fence, and they're saying, right now, especially because prices sure are high. I think I'll wait for home prices to come down next year, or I'll wait until after the presidential election. Like that's going to make some sort of enormous change in the housing market. And by the way, you might get a slightly better deal on the house. But I'm not seeing any kind of indication of a bubble burst coming on. And I swear that I would tell you that if I saw it coming. It was one of my sacred commandments that I talked to you about in podcast number 1. I'm going to tell you the truth no matter what, even if it hurts me or my business. Okay? So like I said, I don't see any sort of crash coming. If it is, I'll tell you. But there's nothing on the horizon that I see that's going to create a big smoking crater in the housing market. So you may save 10 grand, 20, 30 grand on the price, but nothing spectacular. Just your average, everyday downward cycle. So while you wait on the sidelines, it's very likely there could be an interest rate hike, like we just talked about during that time. So what kind of impact does that have on someone's bottom line? Like, let's say a house is 400 grand right now, but it goes down over the next 6 months or year to 350 grand. But the interest rate goes up a point during that time. So what's the impact of that 1 point over the course of the loan? Because it's actually, when you think about it, the higher interest rate, you're going to be paying a much higher amount over the course of the loan. So go ahead and maybe if you could go into that.
Sure. So the way that we look at purchasing power, that's really what we're talking about.
Right.
So if you're pre-approved for a $400,000 home at 4.5%, if the underlying interest rates go up half a point, and let's say they go to 5%, so you're pre-approved 400,000. Now your interest rate's up at 5%. What you're actually pre-approved goes down, and the reason why is because we factor in the debt-to-income ratio, right, or DTI. You may have heard that
right
phenomenon, that the metric that we use.
Right.
So what that means is you can actually afford less home because the cost of the mortgage payment is going to go up, right? So a $400,000 loan is going to be at 4.5% is lower than a 5% loan for $400,000.
Right. So if let's say that, let's take it back to my scenario, right, where you've got basically, you have even if you could afford the 400,000, right? Over the course of time, though, it's still going to be where the higher interest rate is going to make it more expensive to have that loan over the course of the 30 years or the 15 years.
That's correct. And that's also why there's pricing pressure on agents that are trying to sell homes for 400,000, because what happens is you have this pool of people that are pre-approved for a $400,000 home. And if they're now only pre-approved for a $375,000 home, that means there's less people out there that can afford that $400,000 home. So there's pricing pressure to actually bring down the listing so that you meet the market.
Right.
Right. So that's why there is that relationship between interest rates and selling a home.
Right.
So it's not just in buying a home where interest rates are affected, it's also in selling a home.
Right, of course. And it also thins out the market completely almost.
It does. It actually, in some places, if you're right there on the border,
right,
then you could be out.
Yeah.
Right? So it actually takes buyers out of the market with rising rising interest rates.
So, we don't like to, look, there's plenty of agents out there that's their entire marketing plan, is to literally go out there and frighten, potential buyers. It's like, if you don't buy now, you're going to. But this is an actual thing that you guys have to think about, that there are different, what's the word I'm looking for? But there's different stages that the interest rates pass through that could effectively remove you from the market. So even if you don't want to buy right now, it's so incredibly important for you to at least have a conversation with one of us so that you can understand what exactly you can buy. What is your purchasing power? We don't like to give you bad news that you might not be in this market, but it's better to know that, because then you can make decisions based on that.
Right. And then the flip side of that is, if you're in a appreciating market, you can't save your way to being able to afford more in a rising market, right? I mean, unless you're just making gobs of money,
right,
and you're able to just contribute, but just regularly putting money away. I've had clients where they've come to me and said, well, I just want to save up more for the down payment. And I said, well, you're not going to be able to outpace the price appreciation.
Right. Exactly.
So you're in the position to buy. Why wouldn't you buy? Why would you spend money paying a landlord and filling their pockets when you could be getting the interest rate deduction from the mortgage, and you'll be in your home and you can start gaining equity on that particular piece of property.
Right. Okay, great. Well, I think that we covered that pretty well. So then let's move on. So congratulations. You just had your offer accepted. I call you up. I say, fantastic. We're all good. They like us. They want to move forward with us. So then it comes down to what happens when the escrow starts. And we're gonna be talking to an escrow person later on, so to really describe the process of escrow and what they really do. But I want to talk about it specifically as it refers to lending and mortgages. So what are the first steps, Ron, once you basically you hear from me, or you hear from the buyer, okay, we're good to go, let's move forward?
Well, something you mentioned earlier, we didn't cover it, but I think this would be a good time to talk about it.
Yeah, please.
Are the fees and points.
Right. Yes. Right.
So fees, you hear on the radio, right? You hear that you could get a no cost, no origination fee loan for 2.625, right? And you're thinking, well, my loan officer told me he's going to give me a rate at 3.5%. How in the world can they offer that? And he's charging me closing costs. How do they do that? Well, they don't do it by magic. What they do is they do two things, right? And if they don't tell you this, and if they say, no, it's truly no fees, they are lying to you.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So again, protector, loan officer, that's the whole spirit of things, right? So number one, what they're doing is they can add the cost of the actual closing cost to the loan, right? So if your loan amount is $400,000, closing costs are, say, $10,000, they can make the loan amount for $410,000, right? And you just amortize those costs over 30 years, which a lot of people do.
And by the way, can they also throw in PMI as well into that, or no?
Sure, we could talk about mortgage insurance in a little bit.
Okay,
but what they're able to do is you could add that to the loan amount, provided that you're putting enough down, right? In a purchase, it's a little more tricky when it comes to that. But essentially, that's the idea, right? So that's one way. The other way is a lender can actually go up the rate sheet. So if the rate starts at, say, 4.25%, and that is at a loan amount of $400,000, well, if the closing costs are $10,000, then the lender can go based on their rate sheet and look up and say, okay, at 4.5%, there might be about $10,000 of premium there. So we're going to charge the borrower 4.5%, and that'll cover the closing costs.
Oh, got it.
Right. So those are the two ways. So there's only three ways to pay closing costs: either out of pocket,
right,
amortize it and put it into the loan amount. We call that financing,
right,
the closing costs. Not no cost, not zero cost,
right,
financing the closing costs, or we simply charge a higher rate.
All right. And to also, I really want to go, I think it's going to be more effective for everybody out there that we go granular with this and really say, okay, what is a closing cost? What qualifies as a closing cost? I mean, I know that it's a spectrum, but if you could maybe kind of drill down on that. Sure.
So closing costs. So what we're looking at, there's hard costs, right? And the hard costs, these are costs that are standard across whether you're refinancing or if you're purchasing a home. They include the lender fee, right? And these lender fees, they go anywhere from $800 to $2,000. But this includes underwriting, processing, document preparation.
It's basically what you're paying for the people to do their jobs.
Correct. It's an admin fee.
Right.
Right. It's not the commission.
Right.
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 I wouldn't be in this room if that was the case.
Right. Right.
So the next piece is you have title, right? And in a purchase transaction, you have lender's title, which is paid for by the buyer. And then you also have owner's title insurance. That's typically paid by the seller, right? And title insurance, we'll go into a future podcast and talk about, the very specifics of it and how it protects you. But basically what it does, it's insurance that protects you from any foreseen title issues, any tax liens, anything wrong with the property that you're trying to buy, right? So it's very important and it's required.
Incredibly, yeah.
Yeah. Escrow, right? So that's another fee. And escrow, think of it as a big piggy bank, right? So it's a big outside account. They're an independent third party. And escrow is responsible for receiving payments, distributing payments, and then accounting for all of the transactions that go on in a deal.
Right. I mean, it's basically they're a ledger of debits and credits, and at the end of the day, there needs to be a zero. If there's not a zero there, something wonky has happened along the way.
I mean, they account to the very last cent.
To the last cent. Absolutely. Right.
Next, you have an appraisal fee.
Yeah.
Right. And an appraisal fee, this is an upfront fee, similar to the inspection, right? So what we do is we will gather the credit card information. We'll get the credit card information from the borrower. Know that an appraisal, it's non-refundable. Right. So it varies based on the size of the property, number of units, where you are throughout the U.S. in your particular area. Appraisers, they have different methodologies. There's different types of appraisals that are out there, but generally you're looking for anywhere between maybe $350 to $800, right?
Right. And basically what they're trying to do is establish the value, the actual value of the place, so that when you're trying to get a loan for, let's say, $400,000, that basically the house is worth $400,000. I mean, that's what your lender really wants to know, because if, God forbid, you should not be able to make your payments or whatever, they want to be able to go back to the market with it and sell that place. And
that's exactly right.
And if they can't, if the value's not there.
Right. So it's the documentation that protects the lender.
And when we go into appraisals, we'll have a conversation about that. Lots of times, and it's happening more than I've seen in a long time, appraisals are not matching what the value we think the value is, and so there has to be a horse trade that happens at that point to basically make sure everybody's okay. And
absolutely,
yeah.
and there's protections for you, right?
Right.
You have those contingencies to protect you. The next one, you have prepaid interest, right? So that's and the best way to describe it, when you start a loan and you then fund the loan. Let's say we start the loan, it's October now, we fund November 4th, right? So woohoo, keys in hand on November 5th. And the best part is your first mortgage payment is January 1st, right? So you skip a month, which is always nice. But you have the whole month of November that you're now the owner of that loan. So you pay from November 5th to November 30th.
Right.
And that's the prepaid interest that you would pay. So it's just the number of days. That's the reason why a lot of closings happen at the end of the month, to avoid the extra prepaid insurance. The downside is there's a bit of a bottleneck because everyone's trying to do it at the same time.
Right.
Right. So it's a little slower right now because we're at the beginning of the month.
Right. Okay, great. Anything else in terms of closing costs and what they are?
Just a couple other ones. You have taxes, property taxes. In California, we take 1.25% of the purchase price, and that becomes your property taxes.
Right.
Right. So what will you do is you have two options, and this is really important, right? So when it comes to property taxes and insurance, there are two ways you can do this, right? So provided you're putting down at least 10% and provided that the specific lender and program that you're using allows you to quote unquote escrow your property taxes and insurance or impound. There's two ways to talk about it. Basically, it means that you're paying, when you make that mortgage payment, it's bundled where you're also paying your property taxes and insurance. Right. So there are two people out there. Number one is the set it and forget it.
Right.
Right. So these are the people that,
and I'm not ashamed to say that's me.
No, and you're conservative.
Yeah.
Right? You're a conservative guy. So set it and forget it. Majority of homeowners do it because they don't want to have a big property tax bill.
Exactly.
Right? Then you have the other camp where they would rather have as small of a payment as possible. And they are either financial gurus or maybe their income fluctuates, right? So they could be in the entertainment business.
Right.
They could be in sales where they get these big bonuses, and that big bonus or big payout, that will cover their property taxes.
Right. I mean, I think that also you have the people who basically, it was interesting, when I was just coming out of college, I was actually in charge of all the non-impounded loans in California for Wells Fargo. Sorry, not Wells Fargo, Great Western. I was in charge of paying the taxes for LA County for all the basically non-impounded ones, basically because they would, wait the entire year or whatever, and they wouldn't do it. And of course, some wouldn't.
Right.
It'd be basically, well, we got to get that thing paid or else the government is going to repossess the house. So, yeah, and I think that the thinking behind, we always said the thinking behind a lot of these people, and I'm not going to say for everybody, but that it was basically they didn't like that we were getting the interest on that Wells Fargo was, because as you put money into that impound account, well, at Great Western and whatever impound account it is, gets that money basically for it sitting there.
That's true. That's true. And there are people that will say, no, I would rather hold it in my own interest-bearing account.
Right.
And I'll make the payment. Now, I mean, where interest rates are today, what's an interest-bearing account?
Right. Exactly.
Right. What are you going to earn on that $3,000 that you have sitting in that account?
Exactly.
10 cents.
It's. I mean, the hassle that it's worth is not worth it. Is what I
exactly.
And that's why I set it and forget it, and I don't.
Right.
I learned from my time in the trenches.
Exactly. So the best way to describe the taxes and insurance is if you are setting up that impound account, the lender is going to ask, first of all, that you're making the property taxes for the next payment period. In LA County, the taxes are due on the 1st of November and the 1st of February. So if you're buying now, first half property taxes are due, so you're looking to pay at least 6 months, right, in advance. So that's something to keep in mind because that's a lot of money, right, depending on the size of the property and everything else. The other piece is insurance. So insurance, if you are setting up an impound account, the lender wants to make sure that you have paid at least a year in advance to cover that impound account, right? Because the last thing they want is to take on a loan that the property's not insured.
Yeah, right.
Right.
House burns down, it's kind of hard to repossess.
Exactly.
It doesn't exist anymore.
Exactly. So that's just something to keep in mind. So if you have a impound account, you're going to be paying more in terms of the amount that you're going to prepay, but the dollar amount that you're going to pay if you do your own taxes or if you have the impound account, it is exactly the same. Right. The only difference is, like Tom was talking about, you could earn interest potentially on
and then maybe if
account.
interest, people were getting interest rates of 20%, it might be worth it, but I mean it seems silly at 3% or 2%.
Exactly. And then the last fee that you have associated are government recording and transfer fees, right? So these are standard. It depends on your state, depends on your county, depends on your city. But basically the recording fees, it covers registering the home in the new buyer's name. And then the transfer, it's the documentation that shows the transfer of ownership between the buyer and the seller.
Got it. Okay, great. So, all right. So we've now established what those closing costs are. We know that we can now potentially, possibly, depending on the loan, fold it into the actual balance of the loan.
You want to talk about points?
Yeah, let's do that right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So points. So the way that points work is a lender might charge you an origination fee to buy down the rate. So these were very popular years ago when you had a rising interest rate environment, because if your rate was, let's say 5%, right? And 5%, that's a big stretch. But 4.5 sounds a lot better, and you may have some extra money, right? So it may make sense to buy down the rate or pay a point to get the rate lower.
So what is a point?
So a point is 1% of the loan amount, right? So at a $500,000 loan, that's $5,000.
Right.
Now, it doesn't mean that you go from 5% to 4%. No. It's just a dollar amount that can be used to apply to the pricing of a loan.
And on average, doesn't it come down just about like a quarter of a point for each point?
Yeah, I would say that.
Roughly. So basically, if you pay $5,000 in, you can reduce your interest rate by roughly a quarter point, roughly.
Right.
Of course, all loans will vary, but that's what I've kind of seen out there.
Yeah, and then there's also fractions. So it's not a whole number, right? It's not just 1%. It could also be a quarter of a point or a half a point.
Right.
And that could just get you into various bands, right? And it's something that we also use if we need to reduce the debt to income ratio, right? So we find out that a borrower, they're tapped out at 5%, but at 4.5%, we're looking good. So these are things that we can use in our toolbox.
So briefly, you mentioned it just there, debt to income ratio, define that, and also let's go at that point. It's also with LTV as well to explain that you have basically those I think are also incredibly powerful in terms of your purchasing power as well. You have your debt to income, which basically tells whether or not how much you can borrow.
That's right. So a debt to income ratio, this is an equation that the lenders and the various financial institutions, they've come up with as a way to minimize their risk. Right. So, it depends on the program. I mean, I've seen DTIs go up to 55. I've seen DTIs go as low as 30. It all depends on the loan, depends on the investor, depends on what you're buying, all of those factors.
Right.
In general, 43.
Right.
That's the number that I'm looking for when I'm looking at a pre-approval. Obviously, I'm checking all the guidelines, making sure that the loan that we're going to put our borrower into fits that model, right? But generally, 43 is a good number. And again, what that represents is $4,300 of debt, which would be all of the debt that the borrower has, plus, so that's their student loans, that's their credit card payments, car payments. On top of that, we're also adding in the principal and interest, so the mortgage payment, the taxes and insurance, and HOA if it's a condo. Right. So any of those fees.
And I'll tell you something. That's a lot of shoppers out there totally forget about the HOA until they get in there. And it's like you do realize it's $400 a month extra on top of that payment.
Yeah, so. I've seen people get killed right from there.
Yeah.
Right. Just because the HOA is $400 and they didn't have a lot of room to begin with. So that's something to keep in mind for sure. So that is one aspect of it. So the debt ratio, there's and I hinted at this a little bit, but I'll explain it. There's a front end ratio. And the front end ratio, that is your subject property. So the property you're going to buy, right? So that is the mortgage payment, the taxes, insurance, HOA, front end ratio. The back end ratio is all that, the PITI, right? It's called PITI.
Principal,
interest, taxes, and insurance. Plus all of your outstanding debt. So that would be your minimum monthly that you pay, and that shows up on your credit report, right? So when we run the credit report, it actually will come up with the minimum monthly number. We plug all those numbers in. It's all calculated for us. It's beautiful. Don't have to get out a slide rule or any of the
Not good at the maths,
stuff.
Ron?
No, it's all good. It's all good. Computer, I certainly double check it. That's for sure. But the back end ratio, that's what we call it, the back end ratio, that includes your PITI plus the minimum monthly on your student loans, minimum monthly on your credit cards, your car payments. Plus, if you are a homeowner and you have other properties, we're adding that in as well, right? So someone who has lots of properties, we've got to factor that in, right? But if you have investment properties, we can also factor in that income, right? So that helps offset that. So the DTI, we're taking all of that debt and then we divide it by the income, right? And as I said, we're looking around 43 as a general rule. So that basically means that your debt could not exceed $4,300 if we need $10,000 of income, right? So 4,300 divided by 10,000. So that's 43. So that's how we get that particular number. So that would mean someone who has a salary of $120,000 can only afford to have $4,300 of debt, right? And we can back out all those calculations. It's much easier just to start from scratch and be able to calculate everything and run their credit and look at those. But I've reversed engineered many a loan before.
Right. DTI is person specific. LTV is really property specific, isn't it? I mean,
that's correct. That's correct. So LTV stands for loan to value, right? And again, loan to value, it's going to depend on the particular investor, right? So some investors and some programs, they'll require 20% down, right? That's the most common that's out there, right? So for those, that means you're putting down 20%. So an 80 LTV is the same thing as 20% equity, right? So those numbers are synonymous. The next piece to that is there's other programs that are out there where they only require 3.5% down, right? Or 96.5 LTV, right? So what's important about the LTV really comes into play with the lender's guidelines, right? So let's say we have a 80 loan to value where the property is $500,000 and the borrower, they're putting down 20%, right? So that's $400,000 loan.
Right.
So we go out, we do the appraisal comes back, and the home's now worth $450,000, right? So that's $50,000 under. So does that mean now that your loan to value is calculated off of still at the $500,000? No, it's the value, right? So it's that appraised value.
Right.
So what that means is now the borrower will either need to put in more money to compensate for that delta, or the agents are going to have to negotiate down. Right. What I've seen, what happens the majority of times, I've actually seen it come all the way down. Right. Yeah. It depends on how savvy of the agent is. Also depends on how desperate the seller is. Right. So that's another factor. But I've seen a majority of cases they meet somewhere in the middle.
Right. And basically that's what the appraisal contingency is for. And we'll go into contingencies a little bit more on a future podcast. But basically what you need to know about contingencies is basically your parachute. It's or ejector seat is actually probably a better comparison. Where basically, and usually, generally from the contract here in California, the appraisal is up at 17 days, but it's not a if you pass through it, you're done. It's like, okay, it didn't hit the appraisal. You have to release it actively. They can't just pass through a date and everything goes away.
That's correct.
Right. So basically that's, whenever you've got two people, let's say there's two or three offers on the table, they've got a backup offer and somehow the appraisal comes in low, you can pretty much bet that, they might talk to you because they don't necessarily want to go to that backup offer because there's all sorts of can of worms that can be opened up there, but you don't have as much leverage as if you're the only, girl at the party, you know what I mean?
Right, exactly. So, it all depends on also what you're putting in, right? So if the guidelines require you to put down 20% and you're right there at that number, then the only way you could get that loan is putting in more money if the agents haven't negotiated to that point. So where you're stuck at, say, 450. Right. But if you were putting 40% down, and this just came up with a buyer where they were putting down 40%, the appraisal came in a little lower, they renegotiated. She actually paid it down to get to that 40% down or 60 debt or 60 LTV. And that actually helped her with her rate, but she didn't have to.
Right.
Because the lender required 20% down. Right. So that's something that, an appraisal, it's a key part of the overall process. And we'll go into looking at the various steps, but that's something that you definitely need to hit pause and have conversations with your buyer's agent and everybody involved in the transaction. Cause it's a critical part.
Yeah. Now, I want to actually take a moment to pause here for one moment and go backwards for just a moment, because when you brought up the HOAs, for some reason it clicked. I totally something I wanted to chat about. Something that when I first became an agent kind of blew me away because I didn't even think about it. When you have condominiums, right, there's actually a limit to how many, if there's too few owners on the property, that it can actually affect not getting a loan. Like, let's say that you have a condominium that's got 10 people 10 units, and let's say that it only has 3 owners or 2 owners, it could actually affect whether or not the lender will give you the loan. Because, and Ron, maybe you can go into more detail about that.
Right. So what the lender is looking for is they are looking at the condo to make sure that it conforms to Fannie and Freddie's standards, right? So you have condos that, and this especially applies to investment properties.
Right.
Right. So if you
and by the way, and let me back up again, just to say, and by the way, when I say 3 owners, what I'm saying is like maybe they, of the 10 units, 8 are being rented out by one guy, or and the other 2 are actual people who live there, who own it. So that's what we're talking about. Sorry, go ahead.
Right. So what the lender is looking at is, there are 2 types of reviews when it comes to a condo review, right? So the lender will have a full review or a limited review. Obviously the limited review is the way to go.
You want if you can get that.
If you can get that. So a limited review is the borrowers put down more than 10%. That they are buying this as owner-occupied, and that the HOA is actually in control of, so the actual members are in control of the HOA, right? So the homeowners are in control of the HOA, versus you're putting less than 10% down, you're buying it as an investment property. The homeowners association is actually in control of the developers, right? These are all potential red flags, and it requires further due diligence, right? And the reason why they have the limited and the full review, it's all protection, right? So when you have an investment property, so let's say your client, they want to buy a condo so they can rent it out. Well, if it turns out that there is a concentration of ownership, right? So you were talking about the 3 owners own all the units. That's a concentration of ownership, right? So that's number one. And then the other piece is if more than 50% of the overall condos are investment properties, that can be a problem, right? Because now it doesn't conform, and we actually have to go to an outside broker in that case that will do those types of loans.
Right.
So the standard is really 50% or lower have to be have to
live there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that it's all associated with risk.
All right. So, okay, really quickly, moving on, I just thought that was an interesting little interjection there.
Oh, sure, yeah.
A little something that I knew that it was a surprise to me when I first became an agent, so I thought, hey, they might want to hear too. So we've now established what the rate is. How do you lock it in?
Right. So what is a rate lock? Right. So a rate lock, it's a promise between us, the mortgage bank, and the lender to guarantee an interest rate for a specific period until that loan's funded, and then that rate continues for the next 30 years if it's a 30-year fixed loan. Right. That's the best way to describe it. You may have heard of a 30-day lock or a 60-day lock.
Right.
So these are specific bands where when we lock the loan, we're guaranteed that rate. So when we lock the loan and it's 4.5%, that's what the client's going to get, provided that we close in time.
Right.
Right. Now, if you get to day 29 and docs are out, but you haven't funded yet, are you going to have to freak out? And no, you don't. There are extensions, right? So there's rate lock extensions. You want to make sure that there's enough money in the overall pricing for either the lender to cover that, or you may have to cover that. Right. And typically that boils down to who's responsible for the delay.
And I really want to point this out because it's happened on a number of my deals. Look, there are all sorts of variables that happen when you start to go through escrow, and you can't. There's no way that you can control them. And I've had where it's at the end of the time, and we've had to call Ron up and say, all right, what's happening with the rate? Can we? How long do we have before we have to pay the extension? And so something to keep an eye on, and also to know when you first start, okay, if it extends, what's that going to impact me? Like, what's going to be the price?
Right. Yeah. So a typical loan is going to cost anywhere between 2 basis points to 2.5 per day, right? And that doesn't sound like a lot, right? So I mean, if you're talking about $100,000 loan, 2.5 basis points, that would be for a $100,000 loan, that's what, $250, right? So it's not a crazy amount, but it can add up.
Yeah.
If you have a 10-day extension,
right,
it's $2,500, right? So these are things you have to keep in mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? And actually, I think it's $25. My math's a little off.
Well, and I think this is going to segue really nicely into the next thing I want to chat with is that, look, there are a lot of things that you guys are going to have to take responsibility of when you get into your escrow. And, if your lender is chasing after you, or they've asked you for things and you're not providing them, you have a lot of responsibility as to whether or not this thing ends on time or not.
That's right. And that's why it's so important to gather all that documentation up front.
Yeah, absolutely.
And do that digging underneath couches and going to the storage room to gather your past tax returns. It's better to get all that stuff when you're out of escrow. Right? Because you have time.
And to be perfectly honest, if you're listening to this podcast, that's probably not you anyway. The ones that like basically are the folks who come to us and say, "Oh, do it for me. Please do it for me." And that's probably not you anyway. But to be perfectly honest, I don't want them here because that's not what this is about. This is about educating and making you guys be able to take as active a role as possible in your process.
It's true. In this case, time is money.
Exactly. So we're trying to find you ways to make sure that this is as smooth a process as possible. So when we go into the underwriting process, what can be done to basically, and underwriting is basically the lender just, saying, well, we need to hit these kind of conditions in order to make sure the loan is viable, basically. It's like a stress test, I would say, right? Ron, is that kind of an accurate?
That's right. That's right. So when we start a loan, we're given, us being loan officers, we actually are given the roadmap on how this loan is going to play out. Good ones do. Right. So before I even issue the pre-approval letter, I will run an automated underwriting system, right? So if it is a Fannie Mae loan that we're going to send to Fannie Mae, then I am going to run Desktop Underwriter. These are very sexy names. So DU is another name to describe it. If we were selling it to Freddie Mac, then it would be Loan Prospector. All right. All these are automated underwriting systems. But what they do is it actually is the report that the underwriter uses to come up with what is required to put together the file to send it to Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. So it's very important that the lender reads it, right? Because what it's going to show is it's going to say, we need X amount of years of tax returns, or we need this in terms of transcripts. It's going to say, this loan requires 6 months of reserves. These are all things that are really key. And if your buyer doesn't, or borrower doesn't conform to these areas, that's a huge red flag.
Right.
Because what's going to happen is, sure, you might get a conditional approval from the underwriter, provided you meet these conditions, but if they don't have the extra money, you can't just have, someone wire the money into the account.
Right.
It doesn't work that way.
Right. And we were going to get into that, go into the process, the whole process of what they call seasoning.
Correct.
And what is now, explain seasoning.
So seasoning, so lenders require at least 2 months of bank statements showing that the money is clean, meaning that if you have a down payment for, let's say it's $100,000 and it is October, then we're going to look at September and we're going to look at August. If we show a deposit coming in at $100,000, that needs to be sourced, right? And if you want it to be completely clear and seasoned, then deposit it in July. Right? Because we're not going to ask for a July bank statement. So it has to be seasoned for 2 months in order for us to count that in terms of assets.
And where can what sources can those monies come from? Like, is it okay if your parent gives you that money or something like that? Or is it?
It is. Absolutely. The cleanest, absolute possible way is if you have a gift, right? So we're going to talk about gifts, right? So a gift is the amount that a family member, and a family member can be a brother, a sister, a mom, a dad, a stepmom, stepdad, grandparents, aunt and uncles, no cousins,
Okay.
No cousins.
So they do cut it off at
There is a
distant
cutoff.
cousins.
Yeah, and second cousins and nephews and all that kind of stuff. Like so there is a cutoff.
Yeah.
But a family member, they will give you money, and there is zero obligation of returning that money.
Right.
Because that is what you are signing.
Right.
Right?
It's not a loan.
It is not a loan. It
Yeah.
is absolutely not a loan.
Right.
So what you will be signing is a gift letter that says, I am giving this money free and clear. And there's a couple ways that you can give that money. The easiest possible way is you have the donor, so that would be a parent in this case. They will put down their name of the account, the exact dollar amount that they're giving, and that they are going to wire it directly to escrow at the end of the transaction. And the reason why you want to do that is because now we don't have to ask the parents for a copy of their bank statements.
Oh,
right?
Good.
Because sometimes, parents are a little
Right.
wary about.
Well, and there's also, it's interesting. Sometimes you can actually get into more trouble by giving people more information, because what happens is that you open up these cans of worms where people go looking and digging, and it's like you didn't have to give it to them. So why did you give it to them in the first place?
Right. Yeah. I had I had a case where I had a buyer, and she's Australian, and her boyfriend gave her money and deposited it into her account because she didn't want to have to pay the exchange rate, because her money was coming from an Australian bank and would be converted to US dollars, which doesn't go as far apparently.
Right.
And she just had her boyfriend go ahead and wire the money, and then she wired it in, and we had to source all of it, which meant that we had to get a gift letter from the boyfriend. We had to get, there were all of these, and at that point, thank God they were on the way to get married, so they were fiancés. So, but it was a huge hassle, and we were trying to close, and we were in the middle of that. So please, and that's what's really important is communication, right? I mean, that's
and let me say, what I'm saying here is, absolutely, when your lender or loan officer asks you for something, produce it, and produce it quickly. I'm not saying that, but what I am saying is keep your cards close to your chest. If there's no reason for them to get anything that they haven't asked for, then don't give it to them. Don't offer it. Don't volunteer it, because that could literally throw a monkey wrench into the works that just didn't have to be there.
That's true. I mean, this is, an underwriter, they're not a priest, right? So it's not a confessional.
Right, exactly.
You don't have to give them every single thing that you possibly have done since kindergarten. That's not the case. And your filter is a loan officer.
Right, and they should be that effective filter. But at the same point also, just, even with the loan officer, Ron excluded, of course, because he's so perfect. Just kidding. But even with them, just make sure that there's a very good reason why you're handing over this information, and I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that. Just make sure that you're not just throwing everything at them and hoping that they can sort it out, because guess what? They're going to probably find all sorts of bumps and things that you never planned for. Yeah,
we talk about scenarios, right? We talk about hypotheticals, and that's our job is to give guidance.
Yeah, right. Okay, great. So, all right, going back to now another thing is, what are sources that are not acceptable for a down payment to come from?
Oh, I'd say terrorist countries. No, I'm kidding.
Briefcases with handcuffs on them.
Cash. You can't have cash, right? So you can't hand cash to an escrow officer. So it has to be in a bank. They take that very seriously.
No credit cards.
You have to be careful, and I think a good person to talk about this would be in future podcasts would be a financial advisor, right? Because what's important is that those assets, you have to make sure that those assets are liquid. Right. I've had cases where someone has produced a statement and said, okay, here's what I have for the down payment, and it was a hedge fund. Well, hedge funds, they might have a lockup period. Right. And you might not be able to get that money, which means that you're not going into escrow that month. You're going to have to wait until it's been liquidated and everything else. And I mean, I have a background as a financial advisor, so I just knew that in general. So those are things to keep in mind.
Right.
And yes, there are certain countries that are on higher watch lists and all of that,
Right.
Due to the Patriot Act. So
Right. So, okay. And we're going to be kind of getting to the point where we have to kind of wrap up at this point. So if you were to come up with some tips for how you can smoothly kind of make your way through the underwriting process, what would be those tips? Like, what would you say? Like, tell us best case scenarios, like, you know what, do this, X, Y, and Z, and then worst, give me 2 or 3 worst case scenarios.
So it all starts with your preparation in the very beginning outside of escrow. Right. So it's very important to be prepared and to have the time to go through and evaluate every possible scenario and work with your lender and question anything that might pop up as an issue, right? It's so much easier to do that outside of escrow. Right. So that's number one. Number two, you want to start the loan off in the right way. Right. So when we open escrow, what's really important is that you send in that earnest money deposit right away. So you have your offer is accepted and all parties have executed the agreement, which just means everyone signed it, countersigned it. You want to make sure that you send in that earnest money deposit. And the reason why is because escrow, they will not release fees to the lender unless the deposit's there.
Right.
They don't even get started.
And let's also separate that out from, you have the earnest money deposit,
right?
The EMD.
It's 3.5% of the purchase price.
Basically, 3%.
3%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That basically is different from your down payment. So basically, the earnest money is basically, it sits in escrow, and let's say something goes really bad with the transaction, you back out after a contingency has been released or something like that. It gives the seller something that they can hold on to.
There's some skin in the game.
There's some skin in the game, and basically say, we have this. You for the pain you put us through, the damages of basically maybe missing a window in the market where the house is now worth less. That's a very valid thing that can happen sometimes.
Absolutely.
In a very volatile market. So that's what the earnest money deposit is. 3% is different from the down payment, which has to do with what you're putting in, skin in the game for the loan.
Correct. That's correct. So what you've got in terms of the overall cost that you're going to be sending to escrow, you have the original 3%. And if you're putting down 20%, then the next 17% would be the balance of your down payment. And then you have closing costs.
Right. Okay, great. Well, I think that's pretty good for today. The next stage that we're going to be looking at is taking it to close. That'll be the next episode of the podcast. I think it's a good place for us to wrap up part 2 of our Mortgage 101 episode, part 2 of our Mortgage 101 episode. Thank you, Ron, as always, for being an awesome guest.
No, my pleasure.
Co-host. As always, I want to thank him and his company, Guaranteed Rate, for letting us record our podcast in their lovely offices here in Pasadena. Why don't you go ahead and give the folks the places where they can contact you if they want to ask you any more questions, get more information?
I can be reached at ron.bruno, B-R-U-N-O, at guaranteedrate.com. I can also be reached on my cell phone, 310-804-8243.
Awesome. And just a reminder to everyone, I want everyone out there to engage and interact with other listeners of the podcast. I want to see you guys asking and yes, maybe even answering questions down in the comments or on our Facebook page. My dream, my goal is that together we can create the ultimate repository of common sense real estate knowledge. But everyone needs to roll up their sleeves and get involved. So the more you guys get your hands dirty, the more you're going to learn and expand your minds. And as we've said, knowledge is courage. So don't hesitate, jump in, get in the mix. In the meantime, if you want to get more information or ask me questions, please email me at tom@clarifiedrealty.com. For more exclusive bonus content and advice between episodes, please check out our website, www.clarifiedrealty.com. I am on Snapchat, Twitter, and Instagram as well. My handle for all three of those are @Clarified Realty. And please check out our Clarified Realty Podcast page on Facebook. I beg of you, please, please, please leave feedback and reviews on iTunes or in the comments section on our page. I definitely want to see everything you guys have to say, good or bad. My amazing theme song, Hey Now, is from the band Wolf. That's Wolf with 2 F's. And please go check them out and like them on SoundCloud. We'll also leave a link to the song in the credits if we can. They rock so freaking hard, I think I can actually see the beginning of time itself. Please go check them out. You won't be sorry. And just a little disclaimer, Ron and I are licensed by the California Bureau of Real Estate. My license number is 01715353. Ron's is...
Guaranteed rate, NMLS 2611, NMLS ID 558706, California.
The advice we give is only for properties located in the state of California. For all other states, please contact your local real estate agent or real estate professional. And that's about it. Ron, you good?
I'm great.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for coming, everybody. And remember, the greatest thing you can ever do is make someone feel at home. Take care, and we'll see you next week.